Our next speaker is Declan Fahy. Declan is an assistant professor at the School of Communications here in DC at the American University. He does research on science journalism and science in popular culture. Declan.
Thanks very much. Great. Which one is it? Okay. Great. Okay. Hi. Good afternoon. I believe you've talked about celebrities already this morning. I believe Professor Caulfield raised the issue and the idea of celebrities as being involved in the communication process around science. And as I understand it, it was from the point of view of, say, celebrities from entertainment communication and how when they talk about science or think about science, it can impact public discussion on science and think about science. I hope to contribute to that discussion, but in a slightly different way. My interest is in media culture and how scientists themselves have become celebrities within this broader media culture indeed. But we had a good, I missed the session this morning, but again, talking along very similar lines. We talked about this book, I talked about Tim Caulfield's book earlier. So celebrity and science, it's officially a thing, as somebody said this morning. Now, where I'm coming from on it is kind of topical. You're all familiar with a new type of public scientist that emerged on the stage in the last couple of weeks. Here we have the scientist as TV host, as TV star, with Neil deGrasse Tyson and his Star Talk radio and podcast show moving over to National Geographic TV, where he interviews pop culture figures and talks to them about science and the influence of science on their life. The most recent one I watched was he interviewed Christopher Nolan, the director of Interstellar, itself filled with scientific ideas. And they spoke about the influence of science on Nolan's life and his work. So it's a very rich discussion about science and culture and how those two areas combine, interestingly. My own background in this is my book, The New Celebrity Scientists, Out of the Lab and Into the Limelight, which looks at this idea of scientists who have become media stars, media figures, and these sort of pop culture icons as a way of helping us all make sense of science. Now, my talk today will discuss the broad issue of celebrity and trust. And one of the figures I'll be speaking about today, Stephen Jay Gould, in one of his books said that he learned that you can't assault big ideas. You can't go all in and start talking about them straight away. You have to sneak up on them through particulars. So how I propose to sneak up on this topic, to talk about it, is to look at the public careers of two well-known scientists, Gould and Neil deGrasse Tyson, to give an idea about how these celebrity scientists built trust, maintained trust, and continued to communicate, often over decades. And for anybody to do that in public life, it requires a great amount of public support, popularity, and ultimately public legitimacy to talk about these kind of issues. Many of the things I'm speaking about are a reflection of media culture in general, the growing power of the media, not just as a forum to translate ideas or to disseminate ideas, but the media as a forum in and of itself, in where scientific ideas are debated, discussed, analysed, challenged. So the media is a very powerful force in how scientific ideas come to be understood, debated, and understood. Carl Sagan remains emblematic of this movement. There's a great book called The Visible Scientists, which speaks about how a group of scientists in the 60s and 70s in the US took advantage of this emerging media culture to take their message about science directly to public audiences in the hope of influencing policy ultimately. And Sagan remains in many ways an emblematic figure of this movement. So the rise in media is just one of several larger structural historical factors that have given rise to celebrity science and the importance of celebrity scientists. I've been hugely influenced by this paper by John Agar, a historian of science at University College London, asking the simple question, or apparently simple question, what happened in the 60s? And part of his discussion analyses three larger trends, cultural trends happening around science. all tied in different ways to prominent books. Silent Spring, you're all familiar with Rachel Carson's book, not only sparked and catalysed the environmental movement, but one thing that is more interesting about it, I think, is that it also brought scientific discussion out of the conference halls, out of the pages of journals, and into the public domain, especially discussions of uncertainty and what uncertain social consequences might happen of scientific advance. So this is one factor happening in the 60s. Structure of Scientific Revolutions, published the same year as Silent Spring, Thomas Kuhn's classic work arguing against the standard idea of scientific progress, brick by brick by brick, ultimately building a temple of truth. Kuhn argued that no, science happened through a series of revolutions where new paradigms, new way of understanding the natural world occurred. And then finally, towards the end of the 60s, James Watson's Double Helix brought readers inside science, showing it, yes, to be about the pursuit of knowledge, but also about intense rivalry, competition, fights for status, individual scientists seeking renown and celebrity. And so all of these books, in their different ways, brought us into science and brought science out into public culture and forms an interesting background to our work. The idea of scientific literacy is one I'm sure has come up already, but one that always recurs in these conversations. And again, I'm highly influenced by John Durant's paper here. John Durant was an editor of the journal Public Understanding of Science and looked at this idea of scientific literacy. And he described it as having three connected processes. First is the most basic idea, the idea that everybody brings to it when they first think of scientific literacy, understanding scientific facts and ideas. Okay, that's the basic one. But Durant goes deeper. He says that scientific literacy also involves understanding how science works. And by that he means scientific thinking, the role of evidence, the different types of study, what is meant by peer review, what is the balance of evidence or weight of evidence on an issue. And finally, the third level of scientific literacy, as Durant argues, is knowing how science really works. Now, in the words of Stephen Jay Gould, this is understanding science as a gutsy human enterprise carried out by people, not robots programmed to gather pure information. And so this work has been influential in my thinking about scientific literacy. And what I want to do is give some reasons why I think that this concept of scientific literacy is important for scientific celebrity and science communication more generally. I'm going to start with Stephen Jay Gould, a picture taken in 1997. Gould here with the tools of his trade, fossils and books, and this image that Gould has of a very kind of ordinary guy, kind of this kind of man of the people kind of image that was so intrinsic to Gould's public popularity. But I want to go back a little bit and talk about how Gould established his trust in public and how he went on to maintain it. And here is the first kind of idea I want to put across, is that to be this scientific celebrity, your authority at the start is grounded and draws from science itself. Gould graduated from Columbia in the late 60s with a PhD in geology with a focus on paleontology, and his specialist area of interest were snails, land snails, Syrian, a snail here come to the West Bahamian Islands, and a good species to study if you're an evolutionary biologist because their evolutionary history is written on their shells. Gould published in those areas, but he went on, and with a colleague, Niels Eldridge, you'd be familiar with this, came up with the idea, the theory of punctuated equilibrium, a different understanding, a different way of thinking about how evolution happens. It's not, they saw that the huge gaps in the fossil record were actually not an absence of evidence, but they were evidence of how evolution happened, in huge periods of stability followed by periods of rapid change. And not coincidentally, Gould in his thinking was heavily influenced by Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So you can see the close thinking there. This paper made them disciplinary superstars, well known within evolutionary biology and biology generally. So this expert authority was created first within scientific communities. And the best conceptualization of this is intellectual historian Thomas Bender, who talks about two different cultures, not the two cultures of T.P. Snow, but an expert culture and a public culture. And the expert culture is the culture of journals and specialization and publication and academic specialization, essentially. Public culture involves readers, writers, critics, citizens, the public, who all discuss these ideas. So what happens with Gould and with celebrity scientists in general, they move from and between expert to public culture. And Gould did this in 1973 when he started writing for Natural History magazine and wrote for, I think, about 25 years afterward. And so he wrote his column for wider audiences, but also maintained his role as an active researcher, so flicking between these two roles, interestingly. 1977 saw the publication of two major works, published the same year. Ever Since Darwin, a collection of his essays, and I always pronounce this incorrectly, so excuse me, but ontogeny and phylogeny, one for specialists, one for broader culture. New York Times reviewed them both together and argued that it was amazing that somebody could do this in the same year, number one, but they shared similarities. Both books brought readers into science, into the personalities, into how the science was developed and come up with. And the reviewer for the New York Times said, well, thinking about wider communications, spoke about, well, what are readers to make of various expert claims, contending expert claims? How do you get over that? How do you get past that? And the reviewer said you need to understand how science really works. And then the next question was, how do you penetrate science? And his solution was read Stephen Jay Gould as a way to start getting into this idea. Gould was, as a student and growing up, had a strong social activist, political kind of leaning, and his well-known book, The Mismeasure of Man, was essentially an attack on IQ testing and the history of IQ testing, talking about how previous historical experiments around this area sometimes included fabricated data, sometimes included data done by scientists who were sort of influenced by the unconscious biases of their age and produced supposedly scientific results that merely mirrored the prejudice of their age about which groups in society were on top, as it were, and surprisingly, or not surprisingly, whites were always on top with this intelligence testing. Reissued in the mid-1990s after the bell curve, showing how a celebrity scientist can be immersed in important social controversies around science. His public role took him, he testified in the Arkansas trial in the early 1980s, arguing that creationism was not a science. So Gould wrote about this in his work, in his public work, but also in a different venue, in a court, and helping to shape legislation on that issue. At the same time, he also talked about the certainty of science, but also uncertainties within evolution. And to read his work is to see different ways of interpreting, different standards of evidence, how different fields judge the same set of evidence and same type of scientific work. So he's standing up for science, but also bringing readers deeply and closer into science. Celebrity involves also this close merging of argument and sort of autobiography, of image and persona, personality and persona. There's a merging of the two together, public and private. All those kind of barriers disappear in celebrity. And here's Gould, one of his most famous essays, The Median Isn't the Message, talking about how he overcame cancer. And he was given a predicted 8-month lifespan to live, but he delved deeper into the statistics to show how he wasn't just an average number, and he could talk more, and he could fight, as he says, and survive. Throughout the 1990s, he continued to publish books regularly, as well as this blurring of public and private. Selling is a key aspect of celebrity, and the Gould industry really kept going throughout the 1990s. As his editor at W.W. Norton said, that Gould's popularity of his books show not just an appetite for more and more Gould, but appetite for science in all its great variety. And that variety is part of the reason why he is so popular. When he passed away before his time in 2002, there were ideas saying, obituaries said he's the face of science, okay, and this is another feature of celebrity. He's emblematic of wider abstractions. He came to represent science in the minds of many readers. But he also provided, in another obituary, he provided what nobody else really did. And this is this contextual view of science, perhaps showing how science really works. We'll move on to talk about another figure, similarities in ways with Gould, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Also graduated from Columbia with a PhD, also wrote for Natural History magazine, and similar kind of processes are going on with Tyson and how he became a celebrity. He developed his expert authority in graduate school and doing his PhD. But before he graduated, he started writing for a wider audience. At the University of Texas, he took on, there was a magazine published by the university, and he took on this character of Merlin, answering questions from readers. And it was very straightforward scientific stuff. What would happen if the Earth stopped spinning, for example? And he would give answers to those. So he developed his communication reputation while he was developing his expertise in his graduate work. His PhD looked at the area of the galactic bulge, this densely packed area of stars right in the middle there. So interesting with Tyson, you see this movement between expert culture and public culture happening right at the start and early in his career. His autobiography, first published in 2000, but also 2004, brought you deep into the culture of science, and not often in the best way. He spoke about how he faced many challenges in his scientific career because of his race. He spoke about how, when he went to undertake graduate work, the first question he was asked on his first day on the job by the first faculty member he met was, "Hey, you should join our basketball team." He has spoken about how he has got up at conferences and he feels a little bit of resistance from white astrophysicists not used to a black astrophysicist explaining the topic to them. He has talked about his struggles at Harvard studying physics to overcome, as he described it, his kind of felt obligations to serving the black community, as many black intellectuals did, but also, as he says, pursuing his esoteric interest in the universe. How could he reconcile both of those roles? And he reconciled those through his media work, as he would later say, that becoming an expert on astrophysics in the media really, to him, it was an epiphany when he saw himself on television in the late 1970s, because he said the history of TV programming flashed in front of his eyes. Here was an African American giving expert advice on television. The African American was not an entertainer, not a sports person, who was giving expert knowledge on a topic that had nothing whatsoever to do with being black. And he saw this as a kind of a key moment in his own personal development and in culture and science more generally. Remember this story? 2001, Pluto not a scientist, right? It's kind of controversial kind of thing, but it's a safe controversy, right? It's not like stem cells or climate change or something like this. It's a fun controversy, right? Pluto not a planet, right? So this kind of brought him further into public consciousness. But it also had an interesting effect in that here you had a public discussion of ideas that were kind of central to planetary science, categorization, taxonomy, what's in, what's out. And this is a kind of a deeper thing that's going on here with Tyson. And also it shows the power of a planetarium where he worked and the head of that planetarium to influence debate and discussion in public about what is really an internal issue to planetary science. Being good on television is a rare talent and a real skill. And so there has been this kind of investment in Tyson as well. He, as the face of Nova Science Now, he had previously hosted a special on Nova and been a source, but this was his own thing, this was his own show, heavily built and marketed and branded around his own personality. We see it here right on the cover of the DVDs. I bought all the DVDs, I have them, if anybody wants to borrow them, no problem. And he also went on, again, investment from the NSF as this great science communicator, setting up Star Talk Radio. Not just talking about, how amazing science is, but if you really want to get a flavour of how an astrophysicist loves their topic, do read Tyson's columns when he talks about the cosmic perspective and his own sense of how he connects to the universe. It actually is quite beautiful. But here in this discussion, he's talking about issues like race in science, like politics in science. One interview I liked, an early interview on the show, he interviewed Nanette Nichols, the Star Trek actress, about issues to do with how science fiction can raise issues about race and expertise and things like that in a context that's where these ideas can be heard perhaps a little bit more kind of clearly. His influence, though, is not restricted to entertainment. And this is where I think he's a very interesting figure, in that his authority and expertise led to his celebrity status, and his celebrity status has now given him a form of authority to move through different areas and different realms to communicate with different audiences. Okay, Star Talk, one audience. Nova Science Now, probably the same audience. But here, The Case for Space, published in Foreign Affairs, going straight to policymakers. It's excerpted from Space Chronicles, itself an extended piece of advocacy, really, for NASA's continued relevance and appeals for more support to NASA, appealing before Congress on the same issue. His influence enhanced legitimated by the public, building on expert authority, is now moving into the political process directly in a political forum and arena. And then most recently, we see Cosmos, an alliance between Tyson but also Seth MacFarlane, who had the sort of Hollywood muscle, as it were, to get Fox to show the show and distribute it. And we see this going broad on science. Tyson is good on applying some of the ideas of science communication research, meeting audiences where they are and communicating with them on their terms. So what can we learn about the shared similarities? I mean, these are two figures who have vast, rich public lives and careers that are really well worth digging into, and I'm only giving a small overview here. But what can we learn from them for science communication more generally? And I propose there's three things that we can think about. This idea that there is a need and a demand and an obligation and a logic to move between expert and public cultures, that this is a tension for celebrity science and high-profile scientists moving between these two cultures without losing authority in each, which is tricky. Secondly, celebrity scientists have this fusion of kind of autobiography and argument. Okay, their persona becomes the most important. It's how they communicate. And this celebrity persona, the way they embody abstractions like science and rationality and reason, is how now in public life ideas are often encountered and dealt with and talked about and discussed. And so the last part is that with Tyson and with Gould, a major part of their appeal, in addition to their celebrity status, into the way their personalities resonate in broader cultures, is they communicate how science really works. To study their work and to read deeply into their work is to be brought into the heart of science. And I'm looking forward to Tyson's next book, which is going to be about another contentious issue, which I hope will bring us further into science and society issues. He's writing a book about physics, astrophysics, and the military. Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, Erica Shugart, American Society for Microbiology. And I have a question about when celebrity scientists get to the edge of their expertise, because often celebrity scientists start by focusing on what they know very, very well, and then you see it in a lot of the books here. E.O. Wilson's another example, sort of start getting broader thinking. And we spoke this morning about Dr. Oz, who is in fact a physician and has gotten probably right on some sort of big, very far edge of all this kind of stuff. But I did sort of wonder about that aspect of trust and where the trust kind of erodes as they get more broad or slightly outside their expertise, or whether the public sees that or not.
I give two examples, two kind of cases I looked at quite closely that explore different dimensions to this. I mean, it's a kind of an impossible question to answer outside of specific cases. But I'll take one case, and that's Steven Pinker, another thinker. I really admire his work. And in one of his most recent books, I think a collection of his scholarly papers published for a broad audience, and if that's not an indication of scientific celebrity, I don't know what is, a broader audience reading your papers. But he talks about, in that book, that his popular books get more citations often than his academic papers. So his popular books can impact on scientific cultures in a way that his technical papers often don't. In an earlier book, How the Mind Works, he spoke about nowadays there's very little difference between a really specialized expert and a layperson. So specialized have many disciplines become. And so an advantage in his work, and it's why I think one of the many reasons it's cited, is that it provides this overview. It connects fields together. It connects new ways of thinking and understanding problems and issues. Whether that's outside of an area of expertise, I'd be interested to hear what you think. I don't think so. The contrasting, perhaps, example is Richard Dawkins and the trajectory of his career, which has gone from this close analysis of evolutionary biology, and now his work is chiefly as this kind of figurehead for a social movement around atheism. Now, he had always written about religion in his books, but now he has moved, I think, into a completely different kind of social role. So an interesting issue is whether he's regarded as a scientist or a science writer, or perhaps something kind of else now, and something that's kind of different. But this tension between what you can speak about and what don't speak about is inherent in public intellectuals in any field, and the same with scientists too.
Jessica Brooks, Science Technology Policy Institute. I'm curious, I guess, especially comparing, I guess, Dr. Oz to Neil deGrasse Tyson, where do you think public identifies legitimacy in sort of these scientific celebrities? You know, is it their degrees? Is it sort of, do they have their own TV show on such and such channel? I'm curious where they find that legitimacy comes from.
Where the public find the legitimacy?
Right, yeah.
I guess for me, in the way I've kind of argued it in the book, is that it starts with this expert authority that moves out into wider kind of public culture, but you're always kind of moving back and forth between those. And it comes down to, in many ways, this kind of, whether you seem like an authentic kind of figure. Do you know what I mean? And, you know, one of the interesting things that I've enjoyed about reading the Dr. Oz stuff in the past couple of weeks especially is the way it brought into public discussion ideas of the limits of expertise, ideas about funding in science and how it impacts what you speak about, ideas about how values outside of science traditionally conceived, like whether you are good on TV, for example, impact on scientific kind of work, or the huge commercial agenda that's often behind much scientific advice. And what I really liked is the way all of this was brought out into the public domain and brought out as a topic of public discussion. And I think that leads to a richer discussion of science, and I think that leads to a more realistic discussion of science as well. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with Dr. Oz, but by comparison, Tyson never strays too far from his areas of expertise, okay? And so it's kind of different as well. He's not making epistemological claims in areas that are not closely tied to his own, and that might be a kind of difference. Sure.
Hi, Caitlin Shrine. I was wondering if you could share with us your thoughts on where all the female science celebrities are.
Sure. No, I wrote a piece on this a couple of weeks ago at Scientific American, and the book is largely about media cultures. And, you know, it'll be familiar to everyone here, the well-documented structural issues facing women in science more generally. But to that, I would add that there is a structural difficulty within media itself and the media reporting of female celebrity scientists too, in that female celebrity scientists have to negotiate a tricky set of representations in a way that men don't. I'll talk about one specific example in a second, but more generally, two studies. One long historical study looked at representations of women scientists in the press in the US around about 1920s to 1980s, and found that women scientists were talked about their work, but also when they were kind of evaluated and written about in terms of their domestic skills, sewing, baking, things like this. Barbara McClintock, Nobel Prize winner, talked about, I think in the New York Times, it was written about how good she was at baking with black walnuts. More recently, the shift has moved from this focus on domestic skills to a focus on notions of beauty and glamour and a particular view of femininity, as it were. And that has been a different kind of change. And that is something female scientists have to deal with. A study done in Britain looking at profiles of female scientists found that they looked at male and female profiles. And they said the number wasn't important, but the patterns of representation were. And they found that they looked for discussions of how whether the profile referred to how somebody looked, their physique, what they were wearing, how they were dressed. And I think it was 2 out of 5 profiles of men talked about those things. But 1 out of 2 profiles of women talked about those things. So it is a kind of an ingrained way of talking about female celebrity scientists. And Susan Greenfield is a case in my book, and the chapter is Fame and the Female Scientist, that goes deep into these issues. You're familiar with Susan Greenfield, well-known British scientist, neuroscientist, has been called the most famous living scientist, woman scientist in Britain. Controversial figure for all sorts of interesting reasons related to science communication. But right from the start of her public career, she's had to deal and negotiate and walk this line between how much do you have to sort of fit into these representations as a sort of a way just to get a public platform to get your ideas out. So she's continually referenced to how she looks and how she dresses and what makeup she wears and this kind of stuff. So she's, in an interview for the book, she's talked about, she saw that there's necessarily some of that you have to go with to get your ideas out, but the line is very, very blurred, and it can spill over quite badly. And when her marriage broke down, there was huge coverage of stuff like that. So these kind of genres of media coverage, these kind of ongoing way that female celebrity scientists are represented is itself a kind of a barrier, I think, in some ways. Sorry, that's a very long answer.
Jody Lieberman with the American Physical Society, of which Dr. Tyson is a lifetime fellow. So the success of Neil Tyson and Stephen Gould in communicating science to the public is emblematic of the fact that this is a need, right? The problem, of course, is that scientists are not rewarded for communicating to the public. In fact, in some cases, they're actively discouraged by their thesis advisors and the like in doing so. So my question to you is, in examining Dr. Gould, Dr. Tyson's work and how they've acquired public trust, do you have any lessons to bring back to the scientific community in trying to cultivate the future Dr. Tysons or Dr. Goulds?
I've been asked this before, and the short answer is I don't. I think, and the reason I say that I don't is because, Carl Sagan, but also Steve Gould, Neil deGrasse Tyson, their kind of public image, and it arose within a set of historical conditions and circumstances. That can't be replicated, they can't be, wound back to tape and let things run forward again, as Gould once said. So the historical circumstances are difficult to replicate. So how Gould becomes so popular has something got to do with the state of evolution and creationism, right? And so if those historical circumstances change, then that reflects on who becomes a celebrity scientist. But I think there are more positive emblems. I think one person I write about in the book is Brian Greene. And like Gould, he has managed to maintain this very strong professional reputation within string theory and physics, heading up his own institute, right? Along with this very successful popularization career as well. So I think Greene is a very interesting example of someone who can move almost seamlessly between writing papers on string theory, appearing in the movie Frequency as himself, appearing on the Big Bang Theory, writing The Elegant Universe, speaking at string theory conferences. So he's kind of moving seamlessly between these two cultures. And I think I would argue that might be more representative of a type of celebrity scientist kind of moving forward, that it won't be an either-or decision. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.